I stopped buying worms, and my soil came back to life using this simple trick. For years, I did what a lot of gardeners are told to do. If you want healthy soil, you buy worms. Red wigglers, night crawlers, composting worms. Every season I spent money bringing them in, carefully tucking them into beds, hoping they'd multiply and fix everything beneath the surface. Sometimes it worked for a while. Most times the worms vanished, the soil stayed tired, and I was left wondering what I was doing wrong. Then I stopped buying worms altogether. What happened next completely changed how I garden. My soil didn't just improve, it came back to life. It loosened, darkened, started holding moisture better, and suddenly worms showed up on their own. Not a few, hundreds, and I didn't spend a single extra dollar. This is the trick that made the difference, and it's something any gardener, beginner or seasoned, can do. Here's the uncomfortable truth most gardening videos don't say out loud. Worms don't create healthy soil. Healthy soil creates worms. When I kept buying worms, I was treating the symptom, not the problem. Worms are incredibly sensitive creatures. If the soil lacks food, moisture balance, air, or microbial life, they simply leave or die. No amount of buying more worms can override bad soil conditions. I had compacted beds, inconsistent moisture, and soil biology that had been quietly starving for years. Dropping worms into that environment was like releasing fish into a dry pond and hoping for the best. Once I understood that, everything shifted. Worms are not magic, but they are powerful indicators. When they thrive, it means your soil ecosystem is working. Their castings improve nutrient availability, their tunneling aerates the soil, and their movement feeds microbes that plants depend on. But worms are followers, not leaders. They show up after the conditions are right. So instead of asking, how do I add more worms? I started asking, what would make worms choose to live here? That question led me to the trick that changed everything. The biggest shift I made was this. I stopped feeding plants and started feeding soil, right at the surface. Not deep digging, not tilling, not burying amendments where roots are. I focused on creating a living, breathable, food-rich layer on top of the soil, just like nature does in forests and grasslands. This surface layer became the invitation worms couldn't resist. The first thing I did was stop leaving bare soil. Bare soil is dead soil. It bakes in the sun, erodes in rain, and starves soil life. I began covering every bed, every path edge, every exposed patch with organic matter. I used what I already had: dry leaves, grass clippings that had dried a bit, chopped weeds before they went to seed, kitchen scraps buried shallowly, and even torn cardboard soaked in water. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. The key was layering lightly but consistently. I wasn't building a compost pile. I was building a slow, steady buffet. Within weeks, the soil underneath stayed cooler and moist longer. Fungi started appearing. Then the worms arrived. When organic material breaks down at the soil surface, it feeds microbes first. Bacteria and fungi multiply, and those microbes are worm food. As microbial life explodes, worms follow naturally, tunneling upward to reach the feast. This creates a self-sustaining loop. Worms improve soil structure, which improves water infiltration, which supports more microbes, which feeds more worms. No purchasing required. Unlike store-bought worms that struggle to adapt, these native or locally adapted worms know your climate, your soil type, and your seasons. They stay because they belong there. One mistake I made early on was letting mulch dry out completely. Worms need moisture, not soggy soil, but consistent dampness. Once I began watering mulch gently instead of blasting soil directly, everything improved. The top layer stayed slightly moist, decomposition sped up, and worms stayed close to the surface where plants benefit most. In dry seasons, this alone made my beds noticeably more resilient. Plants wilted less. Soil stayed crumbly instead of hard. Another big change was leaving the soil alone. Every time you dig, you destroy worm tunnels, disrupt fungal networks, and expose microbes to sunlight they can't survive. Instead, I let worms do the digging. Over time, compacted soil softened naturally. Roots followed worm channels downward. Water soaked in instead of running off. What used to take a shovel and effort now crumbled easily by hand. This was when I realized something important. Healthy soil doesn't need to be forced, it needs to be protected. This isn't an overnight miracle, but it's faster than you'd expect. Within 2 to 3 weeks I noticed moisture retention improve. After a month I started seeing worms when lifting mulch. By the end of a season, the soil color darkened, and plant growth became more consistent and less needy. The biggest long-term change was how forgiving the garden became. Missed watering didn't spell disaster. Plants handled heat better. Pests became less aggressive because plants were stronger. This is what living soil does. It builds resilience. Since stopping worm purchases, I've also cut back on fertilizers, soil conditioners, and those so-called quick-fix products. When soil life is active, nutrients just cycle naturally. Plants get what they need, when they need it. That doesn't mean I never add anything, but now I add with intention, not desperation. Compost, mulch, and organic matter have replaced shelves of products. My garden became simpler, and honestly, a whole lot more productive. You really don't need acres of land for this to work. I've used the same approach in raised beds and even in large containers, and the results have been, well, incredible. In containers, the key is shallow feeding and keeping the moisture balanced. Even there, worms eventually show up if the conditions are right, or they multiply naturally if a few already exist. The principle stays the same: feed the surface, protect the soil, and let biology do the heavy lifting. Stopping buying worms actually forced me to slow down and observe. It reminded me that gardening isn't about control, it's really about cooperation. Nature already knows how to build fertile soil. Our job is to stop getting in the way and start supporting the process. Once I made that shift, everything changed. If you're frustrated with lifeless soil, struggling plants, or gardens that just demand constant input, don't rush to buy more solutions. Look down. Look at your soil surface. Ask what life there needs to thrive. Chances are, the worms are already nearby, just waiting for an invitation. If this approach helped you rethink your soil the way it transformed mine, make sure you subscribe to Rootshaven Grounds for more real-world, no-nonsense gardening insights. Share this with a fellow gardener who's tired of fighting their soil, and let's grow gardens that work with nature, not against it.